Okay, so this is going to be my Unit 16 summary video. And with the first really key thing about what we do in Unit 16 is we now extend our analysis to the long run. And the first thing to make really, really clear is what do we mean by the long run? Well, as we saw in Unit 14, what determines whether we're in the short run, the medium run, or the long run is what variables we are allowing to now change. And what I mean by that is what variables we are actually incorporating into the model. So in Unit 13, Unit 14, when we were looking at kind of the demand side of the multiplier model, we were only allowing employment and aggregate demand and the level of output and income to change, whereas all the other things, prices, wages, the capital stock, the technology, the institutions, none of these things were actually part of the multiplier model, right? None of them came into our diagram, into any equations that we used. And so we say they're exogenous, right? They're not incorporated. Then to move to the medium run, which is what we did in Unit 14 and 15, all we did was incorporate a way to allow prices and wages to change, right? And we saw that in our labor market model and our Phillips curve model, that firms came into this and made decisions about the wage they were going to pay and the price they were going to charge. And so we had a way of bringing those things into our model. And that brought us to the medium run, right? We allowing prices and wages, we allowed them to change sort of once a year. Now in Unit 16, how we get to the long run is we now allow the capital stock, the amount of capital in the whole economy, we allow that to change. And the way that we do that is by allowing the number of firms in, let's say, a goods market and therefore in a labor market, we allow that number of firms to change. We allow firms to enter and exit. And we imagine that each firm is bringing with it an amount of capital. And so that allows the capital stock to change. Now, important to notice that the technology that's available to firms, the institutions that determine the kind of framework that firms are operating in, those things are still exogenous, right? We don't have any way of bringing them into the model. And so the key thing that brings us into the long run is allowing that capital stock to change. So before we get to this new labor market model with firm entry and exit, we're just going to start with a few kind of key ideas which are part of the model. So the first thing is, where does sort of technological advancement come from? And we saw all the way back in Unit 2 that the reason why some firms will try and come up with new technologies is all about this concept of innovation rents. That if a firm discovers a new technology that lowers its cost of production relative to other firms, then it will certainly embrace that because that's going to increase its profits. And firms that don't innovate or they fail to copy this new innovation, they won't be able to lower their cost of production. They won't be able to sell at a low price and they'll go out of business. And this is all part of this idea of creative destruction, that firms sort of don't adapt, go out of business. Firms that come up with new technologies, they prosper. And then this is also going to have an impact on the employees, which we'll see more of later on. So this process of creative destruction, we kind of think it relies on two things. One is technological progress, and the second is the accumulation of capital goods, an increase in the capital stock. And we imagine that those things kind of go together, right? That to produce or make new technologies, we'll need new machinery, right? That you need to kind of have more machines in order to maybe think about the new possible innovations that could be come up with. But also that we need technological advancements in order to encourage the accumulation of more capital goods. And so the two things really go together, right? We need new machines. We need to accumulate capital in order to develop new technologies. And we need technology to advance in order to encourage the accumulation of capital goods. And this diagram here kind of shows us why this is the case. So a couple of things to point out before looking at the curves. So the x-axis is showing us our capital equipment per worker, right? Another way of referring to that is the capital intensity. So how much capital equipment is available, the value of that capital equipment for every worker. And then our y-axis, our output per worker, right? Our kind of productivity. So what we're actually looking at here is a production function, right? How much output are we getting per worker, dependent on how much capital equipment is available for each worker. And so we see our initial production function is this lower one here, right? And the key thing we're going to analyze and think about is, well, what happens when there is some technological progress? So we imagine that the technological progress, you can see, has shifted the production function sort of upwards. Although I want to be careful because it's sort of kind of, I say shifted it upwards, the gap is not the same all at every level of capital equipment per worker. So you can kind of think of it as like I would say an anti-clockwise, anti-clockwise rotation. But the key thing we see with this new production function is at every level of capital intensity, there is now a greater level of output per worker, right? So the new technology has meant that the capital is being used more productively. So that seems like pretty clear. That's like the whole idea of new technology, is to try and increase the kind of output per worker. And that's what we're seeing here. But a couple of other things to point out. Now, one is just a bit of a reminder of what we mean by the marginal product of capital. And here, that's going to be the slope at a particular point on the production function. And okay, what do we mean by the marginal product of capital? We mean if we increase the capital equipment per worker by, say, 1 unit, how much extra output per worker will we get? So that's an important quantity, right? We want to think about, like adding one more unit of capital equipment per worker. How much extra output are we going to get? That's an important thing to think about. What we see on both production functions is that is getting smaller as we go to higher levels of capital, right? You can see kind of marked out on the lower production function, these 3 points here, those are representing the marginal product of capital at different levels of capital intensity. And you see it's getting shallower and shallower, right? And we see that same thing up here. And what does that tell us? It tells us that there is diminishing marginal returns to capital. Okay, as we get to higher levels of capital, the extra output we're getting from using it is getting smaller and smaller. So that's an important thing to take into account, mainly because of this kind of blue line here. So this blue line represents the average product of capital. Okay, so what is the average amount of output we're getting per worker? And what's interesting here is, so this is showing us sort of like a constant level. And we see on the old production function, that constant level, like that constant average output per worker would be at B. Whereas on the new production function, it's at C. And what's the interesting point about this is on the new production function, to get a particular average product of labor, it's at a higher level of capital compared to on the old production function, which sort of is indicating to us that with this new technology, this new production function, firms have an incentive to accumulate more capital, to have a higher level of capital intensity in order to achieve, say, the same average output per worker as before. And so this kind of ties into what we saw above, that new technologies kind of spur accumulation of capital. New technologies will encourage firms to accumulate higher levels of capital, because those higher levels of capital give the same marginal product of capital as before, and mean that firms can maintain the same average product of capital. So that kind of shows us why new technologies can actually spur accumulation of more capital. Okay, so that's so summarizing, technological progress shifts the production function up, as we saw, and that's going to offset the diminishing marginal returns to capital, right? So just to go back for a second, why is it offsetting it? Because that shift upwards means that now there is an incentive to use more capital, to accumulate more capital, because at higher levels of capital, you are getting the same marginal product of capital as you did at a lower level of capital with the old technology. So that's where we're getting this offsetting, right? A shift upwards means that the diminishing marginal returns to capital won't set in until a higher level of capital. Okay, so that's the kind of really, really key idea. And maybe this last bit, so technological progress plays a crucial role in preventing the diminishing returns from ending long-run improvement in living standards. Okay, so improved technology encourages accumulation of more capital, and that offsets a decrease in the marginal product of capital, which then means that more improvements in technology can spur improved standards of living over time. And we kind of, to link this back to earlier units, this is what we saw was the driving force behind getting out of this Malthusian trap, that living standards were improving faster than the population could increase. Okay, so that's sort of like the first, I would say, key aspect of this long run model. The second thing to introduce is this idea of the Beverage Curve, which I will do in 1 second, just after a short pause. Okay, so the Beverage Curve is just this pattern that was noticed by Beverage between unemployment rates and vacancy rates. So vacancy rates, to kind of put it simply, like how many jobs are being posted by firms, right? That's kind of a simple way to think about it. So what Beverage noticed is that there is this link that when there is high unemployment, you seem to have a low vacancy rate, and when unemployment is low, a high vacancy rate. And that can be explained pretty simply. So these two bullet points do it quite well. If there's a recession, you'd expect there to be high unemployment. And when there's high unemployment, firms are kind of not really thinking about kind of expanding their workforce, right? That they're going to try and make do with their current workforce and potentially even like downsize their workforce. And so they're going to advertise for fewer jobs, so there'll be fewer vacancies. Whereas if there's a boom, we're going to see low unemployment, right? Unemployment is going to decline. And therefore, it might be kind of harder to find workers. And also, there's probably going to be a bigger demand for the product that you're selling. And so you're going to need more workers. And so you start to post more jobs. So that kind of explains, I think, simply why we would notice this pattern, this Beverage Curve. And this data here shows us an example of two Beverage Curves, one for the United States, one for Germany. And okay, in both diagrams, it's clearer in the US. You see that there was this from sort of 2001, 2009, there seemed to be like a very particular Beverage Curve, right? And we see this very kind of clear pattern between lower unemployment, higher vacancy rates. And then after 2009, there seems to actually be a shift to a new Beverage Curve, right? Where now for a given unemployment rate, the vacancy rate is higher, right? And so a complete shift to a new pattern. And with Germany, we see something kind of similar. 2001, 2005, we seem to be on this kind of a Beverage Curve around here. But then after that period of time, particularly kind of after the financial crisis, we seem to have shifted to a new one. And why might this be the case? Well, in particular for Germany, it introduced some reforms to its labor market, which made it easier for workers to find jobs and for firms to find workers. But one big question which might come out of this, which is even when unemployment, say, like really high, there still seems to be some vacancy rate, right? There still seems to be firms that are posting jobs, which you kind of wondering, well, why might this be the case? Surely when unemployment's really high, it should be easy to find workers. There shouldn't be a very high vacancy rate. So the kind of simple explanation behind that is just that there might not be a good match between the jobs available, right, the vacancies posted, and the people who are unemployed. And what I mean by not a very good match is the skills required for the jobs posted might not be like the workers who are unemployed might not have those skills. And that's kind of the simple explanation for why, even at high unemployment rates, we might still have some vacancy rate. Although we can take that a little bit further, in that it might also be that maybe the workers who are unemployed just simply don't have the information about the jobs that are available, right? Or it could be that they do have that information, but maybe those jobs are in a different part of the country that they're not willing to move to. And this is what we mean by labor market matching, that what a government can kind of think about is, could it implement policies, or even could firms implement policies that would make it easier to find matches between a firm and a worker, like matches in terms of skills, matches in terms of locations. And so that's like a useful kind of concept to be aware of, this idea of labor market matching. So why is this brought in here? Well, because obviously when there is creative action going on, people are going to be losing their jobs, right? If firms shut down, then unemployment is going to go up. But what we generally tend to see in the more technologically advanced countries, the more, say, productive countries, is that there is a kind of really quite similar rate of job destruction to job creation. And in some cases, a higher rate of job creation than job destruction. But that's why we're kind of interested in looking at these beverage curves, because it gives us a bit of an insight into what's going on with job destruction and creation. Okay, so right now we start to move towards this model of that kind of long run and what's going to happen in terms of firms. But again, before I go into that, I'm just going to take a pause. Okay, so picking back up. So what we're now going to start thinking about is what factors will determine the economic performance of a country in the longer run, right? In the longer run, meaning where the capital stock can change. And we imagine the capital stock changes by firms entering and leaving the goods market. And we imagine that there's really two sets of incentives that are going to determine this economic performance. One is the work incentives, right? How much of an incentive do workers have to get a job and work hard in that job? And the second is investment incentives. So in order for unemployment to fall in the long run, there needs to be a higher level of output being produced, being required, and therefore jobs being created. And that we've seen is going to come from investments in the capital stock and like improved and technological advancements. So there need to be incentives for firms to provide that investment, in order to kind of produce more capital goods, accumulate those capital goods. And what we'll see is this is going to be a key part of this new long run labor market model. So the first element of this model is the link between the number of firms and what we refer to as, well, so the markup. We've seen what the markup means before. It's the proportion of the price that a good is sold for that goes to the firm as profits, right? So what proportion of the price is actually profit for the firm? So what we look at here is what's referred to as the equilibrium markup, or sort of the long run markup. And so there's two kind of key lines here. The first, this downward sloping blue line. And this one shows us a pattern that we'd expect, that when the number of firms is higher, that the markup available for an individual firm is lower. Now, why does that make sense? Well, we've seen previously that markup is equal to 1 over, and for short, I'll just write elasticity. So, or actually, I'll write it out fully, elasticity of demand. So we imagine when there's an increase in the level of competition in a market, that means the elasticity of demand for an individual firm has gone up. And therefore, if that goes up, the markup that they can achieve is lower. So that's why this downward sloping blue line kind of makes perfect sense. Higher number of firms, that's going to increase the elasticity of demand for each firm, and it's going to decrease the markup that they can achieve, which is what we see happening. More firms to the right means a lower markup. Now, the second key line here is this red one, and this red one is what's referred to as the equilibrium markup, mu star. And this tells us the particular markup where the number of firms entering and exiting the market is equal, which therefore means that the number of firms in the market is staying constant. Right? If the rate of entering and exit is the same, then the number of firms in the market at a particular time is constant. And what's going to determine the equilibrium number of firms is where these two things meet, right? So where the equilibrium markup kind of crosses with this blue line here, that's going to tell us the equilibrium number of firms in the market. And if we're at a different, so say we're at a point here where there's a higher markup than the equilibrium level, then that high markup is going to attract more firms. So more firms are going to enter. So we're going to start moving to the right until we get to this point here. Whereas if there's a low level of markup, then what's going to happen is firms are going to start leaving. And as firms leave, the markup available increases until we get back to this point A. So this is sort of the first key element of this model, which is that the number of firms in the market and therefore the amount of capital is going to be determined by where the equilibrium markup kind of crosses this profit maximizing markup. So that's element number one of this model. And the kind of key thing that this gives us is, well, the number of firms, but also what is the equilibrium markup. And knowing that, we can then kind of have a think about the impact on the labor market. And that's what I'm going to do before then coming back to this better business conditions idea. So, okay, we have seen this equation lots and lots of times before, and I'll write it out. So the real wage is equal to lambda, the productivity of labor, times 1 minus, we've seen mu before, now we're going to write mu star, that equilibrium markup. And what this diagram here is showing us is essentially what is the sort of split of the value of output between firms and between workers. All right, so lambda, that is the value of the output produced per worker. And that value of the output, that's the amount of money the firm is bringing in by selling the output. And that has to be split between the workers in terms of their wage and then the profits. And what this is showing us is how this, or like how this split is done essentially. So if the markup of the firm was 0, right? They're not able to make any profits whatsoever. Well, that means the value of the output must all be going to the workers. Where on the other end, down here, if the markup was equal to 1, right? Think when that's equal to 1, then this whole thing, the real wage is 0, meaning that essentially the firm is making all of the profits and the workers are getting no wage. So those are obviously our two extreme cases. And what this line shows us is all the possible allocations in between. And as you'd expect, as the markup goes lower, as the kind of profit that firms can make goes lower, then the real wage is going higher, right? And vice versa. If the firms are able to make a higher markup, then that means the wages that workers are getting are going lower. So we have seen from the first part of the model that the number of firms and the equilibrium markup will be determined from that first considerations. And then that's going to give us a particular level of mu star. So imagine that that's, say here, this particular level of mu star. And that is going to then determine what is the sort of long run real wage that firms are willing to pay. And the real wage that firms are willing to pay, we've seen that terminology before, that's the price setting curve. So this long run real wage level determines what the price setting curve actually is, right? And how this ties then completely into the labor market, well, if we have our WS curve, then this is going to help us identify what is the labor market equilibrium in the long run, what's the particular level of employment, and what's the real wage. So this is how this new element of our model kind of ties into the determining the long run labor market equilibrium. Okay, so one thing just to go back to is what could have an impact on the position of, or like the position of the equilibrium in terms of the number of firms in a market and the equilibrium markup. Well, typically this is all about, for the most part, all about business conditions, right? If the business conditions, the conditions for doing business in a particular country, if they get better, right? And what does that mean? Well, we'll see a list of some of the things that could happen in a little bit, but to give you one example, if the risk of expropriation, right, the risk that the government or someone else is going to come and take over your business, if that risk falls, then that might make you think that now you would need to see a lower markup to convince you as a firm to kind of enter this industry. And that's what we can see on this diagram here. Here's our initial equilibrium markup. And then we imagine that the government has kind of signed some pledge to say, like, we are never going to expropriate or like take over firms. And therefore, what do all potential firms in this market think? They think, well, okay, now with a lower equilibrium markup, we would be willing to enter this market. That shifts down that equilibrium markup and means that in equilibrium, the number of firms in this market will be higher. So anything that has an impact on the business conditions is going to have an impact on the equilibrium number of firms. And a higher equilibrium number of firms means a higher capital stock. Okay. So what we're going to do now is look at, I think I wanted to look at a kind of, well, actually, I think I've just done it over here, actually. So looking at the kind of final impact on the labor market. So in fact, what I'll do is just run through a kind of full story here. So let's imagine that the markup to begin with, the equilibrium markup was here, okay? And that would mean a real wage level, let's call it W1. And that's going to tell us where the price setting curve is. Okay, so here there's our original price setting curve with this higher equilibrium markup. And now I need to add in wage setting curve. And we see that this therefore is where our long run equilibrium is going to be in the labor market, with a level of employment here, real wages here. And then let's imagine there's been this improvement in the business conditions. The risk of expropriation has gone down. And so the equilibrium markup has shifted to here, this mu star. And that's going to mean we move along this line here so that now the real wage level is much higher. And that's the profit maximizing real wage level. So that's the price setting curve. And so we're now on this higher price setting curve. And assuming the wage setting curve hasn't shifted at all, we can see that the new equilibrium, the new long run equilibrium, is going to be at a much higher level of employment with much higher wages. And so that's the potential impact on the labor market from this improvement in business conditions. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now is take a quick look at the list of things that could lower this equilibrium markup. But just before I do, I'm going to take a quick pause. Okay, so just to finish off this bit. So what are the different factors that might have impact on, says the markup at which entry and exit are zero? That's this equilibrium markup. So I'm going to leave the first one for a second. And all the others we can see kind of all follow the same sort of pattern. So lower risk of expropriation, higher quality environment for doing business, so better human capital, maybe a more educated workforce, or there's better quality infrastructure, a lower expected long run tax rate, lower opportunity cost of capital, lower expected profits on foreign investments, which means maybe it's better to do some domestic investment, lower expected long-term cost of imported materials. All of those things you can see, they are going to make it so that firms are thinking, Now I would need to see a lower level of markup to convince me to say enter that that industry. The first one, the higher competition, that's, I guess, slightly different. It's basically just saying that now are just expecting there to be a higher level of competition when they're making sales, and so they would just accept a lower level of equilibrium markup because of them just kind of now thinking there's going to be higher competition. So moving on from there, what we're now going to look at is the kind of other possibility, the other thing that could have an impact on the labor market in the long run, and that is, what if there's some actual new technology, right? So why is this going to have an impact on the labor market? Well, we come back to this key equation that the real wage is determined by productivity and 1 minus mu, 1 minus, and I'll put mu star here. So lots of stuff we've considered so far is things that are going to have an impact on this, right? On the equilibrium markup, things that might determine what is the equilibrium markup that firms would want to see in order to enter the market. But we can also think about, well, something that might have an impact on the real wage level is changes to the productivity of labor. And something that could do that is some new technology. So what we see here is, here's output per worker with the old technology. And then when the new technology comes into place, that improves the output per worker. It makes workers more productive. And well, what will be the knock-on effect of that? Well, before going into some of the details, what we'll see is the price setting curve will move upwards, right? And we can see that directly looking at this equation. If lambda goes up, W goes up. And that W is the real wage, the profit maximizing real wage, which is what the price setting curve is. So we see the price setting curve is going to shift up by that same amount. And that's going to move us to now a new higher point in terms of equilibrium, higher point in terms of a higher real wage, and also a higher level of employment or a lower level of unemployment. And this is in the long run. So that's the sort of overall impact of this improvement in technology. But we then have to ask questions about, well, is it as simple as that, or what is the path by which we get from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium? And something we'll need to consider is, what are the sort of institutions, what are the institutions and policies of government and institutions in terms of unions and employers associations? And that's some of the things I'll talk about in a second. But what I want to just jump to first of all is one possible story for how this new technology could lead to the new long run equilibrium that we saw. So let's take the steps that are mentioned here. We start at point A, and like initially, the owners of the firm see that they've got this new technology which pushes the output per worker up. So the existing firms, what do? Well, now that they see they can produce the same level of output as before with fewer workers, they fire some of their workers. And we move to the left here, and we move to this point D, where there is now this higher level of unemployment. And here is where we get a very, very important kind of assumption to kind of explain this story, which is this improvement in output per worker and then potential for high profits. What does this do? It attracts new firms into this industry. And those new firms entering need to hire people. And so that's what's going to move us from point D to point E, right? This increase in number of firms means more workers are getting paid, and it's going to push employment up to level E, past A, so a higher level of employment than before. And then how do we make the final jump to get to the new equilibrium? Well, at this higher level of employment, the workers now are going to demand a higher real wage, right? We're moving along our wage setting curve to point B. And so firms, in order to get workers to put in effort, will have to give them that higher real wage. And that's how we end up at point B, at our new labor market equilibrium, where there's a higher real wage and a higher number of workers and an increased number of firms. Now, really key point here, really key assumption. was that once we've jumped down to point D, suddenly new firms will enter and the level of employment will go up. That didn't have to happen, right? And we'll talk about some reasons why that might not happen in a second. But think about the alternative. The alternative is at this new higher level of unemployment, there's now actually this big gap between the wages that firms are currently paying and the wages that workers will actually accept at this higher level of unemployment. So firms actually could have, if new firms didn't enter and kind of increase this demand for workers, if no new firms entered, existing firms could have actually lowered the real wages and kept this higher level of unemployment. So what actually happens in the long run will depend quite a lot on like how easy it is for firms to enter the market. And that's how we come back to some very, very important points here. So how quickly will we see the introduction of these new technologies and getting to this new long run equilibrium with lower unemployment? It's going to depend on a few things. One is what's called the innovation diffusion gap. So how quickly new technologies spread between firms, right? And faster, the better, right? If more firms get new technology, then going back to that low, we would see new firms entering really quickly. But there might be some firms who don't adopt those practices and in fact just keep wages low in order to keep their costs low. And if there's no sort of great incentive for them to adapt the new practice, they can just kind of carry on kind of continuing production, but just with lower wages. We could also see unions have an impact on this. The willingness of unions to sort of accept new technologies or maybe kind of push against them could have an impact on how quickly new technologies come in. And there's also associations of owners, and this could just be groups of owners who kind of get together formally or informally, and maybe they push back against these changes or they adopt them. So these three groups could have a big impact on how quickly the technology gets adapted by all firms within a country. Something else which could have an impact on the speed with which we reach the long-run equilibrium is what's called the employment and wage adjustment gap. So how easily do workers adapt to the new circumstances? And that can be a little bit down to government policy. Government policies like worker retraining, that's really easy for workers to now work in, say, new industries with new technologies. Also could be down to things like product market regulation, competition policy. So how easy is it for new firms to actually enter industries? That's what the competition policy is about. Product market regulation, like are there lots of like standards and bureaucracy around entering a market? So these things will have an impact on the product market competition policy, certainly in terms of how quickly new firms can enter and how that's going to have an impact on employment. And then like government policy and potentially unions as well could have an impact on how quick wages are able to adjust. So these two concepts, the innovation diffusion gap and the employment and wage adjustment gap, they will go a long way to determining how quickly we reach the new long-run equilibrium. And what we'll see later on is that different countries having sort of different institutions can have an impact on this. So one thing to then talk about is what's the effect of, we're going to take this particular example of a new technology. What will the effect be on levels of inequality? So before I get to that though, I'm just going to take a quick pause. Okay, so just picking up on this inequality and how that will be impacted, particular change where there's this improvement in technology. And so we're going to look at what happens when we move from point A to point D, and then from point D to point B, and what they're going to mean in terms of inequality. So to begin with, we imagine we're point A, representing A is where it's our initial level of unemployment, our initial long-run unemployment, and we follow the line and we see change for this. So we follow the line up and we see there, this is the initial wage share that those employees from A up to N, that's their share. And then from N to 100, that's the share of the owners. Right, so that's the blue here is going to give us our sort of initial Lorentz curve, and then we can work out the initial Gini coefficient. So when the new technology is introduced, there's a couple of things that happen. One is that initially, the number of unemployed people jumps up from A to D. So we have, to begin with, a much flatter Lorentz curve, right? But the second thing is initially, the workers are not gaining in wages, right? That the extra value of the output goes completely to the owners of the firms, which means that the share of the now smaller level of employed people has actually gone down to this level here. And so we see our new Lorentz curve is this flat bit, then that section there, and then we go up here. Now there's a much bigger share going to the owners. And you can see we now have this extra blue area. And if we think, remember, Gini coefficient is given by A over A plus B, where A plus B is the area underneath the perfect equality line. So that triangle there. And A is the area between the Lorentz curve and the perfect equality line. So we can now see there is this whole added blue bit added on to that section A. So that's going to increase the Gini coefficient, increase inequality. But then in the longer term, what do we see happen? Well, two things. One is that the number of unemployed people drops actually to this level B. So that flat bit actually goes smaller than either at A or D. And the second thing that happens is we see that the wage jumps back up. And in fact, if we make the assumption that the workers and the owners share equally in this increased value of output, then we're going to return back to the original wage share. And so our new Lorentz curve is this one here. And it looks very, very similar to the original one, except one important change. The level of unemployment has gone down. So now this little kind of pink bit here, that actually represents a reduction in the area A compared to when we were at A. And so actually in the long run, because there are now more people employed, even though the wage share and the profit share are the same, that more people being employed has brought the level of inequality down. And so that is how actually we see changing levels of inequality as a result of, say, new technology. Okay, so I think next thing, I've kind of split them annoyingly, is to briefly talk about how the institutions in different countries or groups of countries can have an impact on how quickly we reach, say, a new long run where there is lower level of unemployment and higher wages. And so the Nordic countries are a good example of countries that actually have managed this process quite well. And they have what we refer to as inclusive unions, right? Where all the sort of workers' unions are kind of working together and they work quite well with the employers so that they like policies not that are about sort of helping workers to adapt, right? Helping workers to gain new skills so that they can move quite easily into new professions. And on the flip side, they're not going to be like very, very difficult when it comes to wage bargaining. They might encourage actually workers to kind of accept lower wages now because that's going to mean higher levels of employment all around. So there's a much more higher level of cooperation. And a similar thing goes, we've got like employers associations. So like the firms and the unions work together kind of collectively to try and improve the long-term outcomes for everybody. So the picture that we had above, that sort of really represents the Nordic model where, you know, maybe in the short term wages kind of go down, but then the firms will then invest a lot more and then bring the level of employment back up. And it's quite easy for those firms to hire workers because the workers have been retrained and have the skills that are needed for these new types of jobs. So the Nordic model is really the one we were sort of looking at. Now Japan and Spain, a couple of differences. So Japan, although we wouldn't say that there's a very strong union system in Japan, we'd say there's very inclusive employers associations. So on the firm side, they're much, much better about making sure that they kind of, I suppose, treat the workers quite well. And so Japan kind of has positive outcomes because of very inclusive employers associations. And when it comes to Spain, we really don't see either of these things. And in fact, we see what are called non-inclusive unions, where they very much stand up against decreases in wages and would want to block new technologies that might lead to higher unemployment in the short term. And as a consequence, we actually end up seeing probably higher levels of unemployment, lower wages in Spain. So this just is to illustrate how different countries taking different approaches to this innovation diffusion gap and the wage and employment adjustment gaps can cause problems in terms of getting to this better long run equilibrium. And in fact, in some cases, these institutions can hold the countries back. Now, something else to look at along the same lines is an interesting idea. So unemployment benefit. So we typically think like that higher levels of unemployment benefit, that's going to mean wage setting curves that are higher up, and potentially that might mean higher levels of unemployment. But what's interesting when you look at the data for different countries, to the right here, gross unemployment benefit replacement rate. This is showing kind of what, how generous the unemployment benefit is, and the further to the right, the more generous it is. And then this is showing us the kind of average unemployment rate. And what's really interesting is countries over here with quite high, like generous unemployment benefits, in some cases actually tend to have quite low unemployment rates, which kind of goes against what you probably expect from some of the models we've looked at, except if you take into account that some of these countries with generous unemployment benefit, they also have these inclusive unions, inclusive employers associations, very, very strong kind of active labor market policies like retraining schemes. And that's why you see sort of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands to an extent, which has adopted some of these models. You see them over here with quite generous unemployment benefit and low unemployment rates. So that's a kind of potentially surprising thing, but you've got to take into account that inclusive trade unions, government policies to help protect workers, they are going to sort of, I guess, mitigate against like the unemployment benefit, causing workers to not want to work. So the final thing to look at, I think it's the final thing, yes, is goods and services markets. And just before I'm going to look at that, I'll just take a quick pause. Okay, so the final thing to look at here is just this phenomenon that seems to have happened in lots of, in particular, developed countries, which is the move towards more services as opposed to goods production. And one way we can think about that is with this model here. So there's a lot of assumptions built into this model, and we'll kind of look at some of the weaknesses in a second. But what we imagine to begin with is we've got this feasible frontier in terms of production of goods and services, right? That to begin with, if we produce no goods, we could produce a quantity 1 of services. So like 100% services, or no services, 100% goods. And what we imagine about consumers is that they want equal quantities of goods and services. And we're going to assume that's always going to be the case. So where's the production going to be on that basis? Well, it's going to be at point A, where the quantity of goods is a half, quantity of services is a half. So there's equal amounts of each being produced, and then everybody's happy. But now what we imagine is that the productivity, labor productivity in goods production increases. Okay. And in fact, we're going to imagine that it doubles. And that's something we have seen happen in goods production. That labor productivity has increased with greater automation and greater use of machinery. And so now our feasible frontier changes to this one. So notice that still, if we produce no goods, we can still only produce quantity 1 of services, because nothing's changed about the labor productivity of services. But in terms of goods, if we produce no services, we can now get twice as much in terms of the quantity of goods. But our consumers still equal quantities of each. So our kind of equilibrium here would be at point B, where we get 2/3 quantity of goods, 2/3 quantity of services. But what does this mean in terms of the number of people who are now working in each? Well, before, when there was equal levels of productivity and we wanted kind of the same levels of goods and services, you'd have the same number of people working in each. But now that there's higher productivity in the goods market and we still want equal numbers of goods and services, well, a couple of things happen. The number of people required to produce, say, 2/3 quantity of goods, that's not, we don't need half the people anymore, right? Because the productivity is doubled. In fact, we're only going to need 1/3 of the labor force. Excuse me. So we actually only need 1/3 of the labor force to produce this quantity of goods. When it comes to the services, we're actually now going to need 2/3 of the labor force to produce this higher quantity of services. So what does this model show us is that over time, workers will actually sort of migrate, more workers will move into the services production, and they'll move away from goods production. And that's what we have seen happen in lots of developing countries. Now, there's lots and lots of weaknesses and issues with this model. And to finish off with, I'll just pick out a few. So one is that to assume that productivity in services has kind of remained constant and hasn't changed at all is a little bit unrealistic. You know, there have been some services where we have seen increases in productivity, so that's a little bit of a weakness. Second thing is, what about the potential for substitution of goods for services? So if goods production has become more productive, then maybe the costs of goods have come down, and so maybe there might be a kind of switch from services into goods. So actually, like an increase in the demand for goods, which would mean we wouldn't see such a decline in the level of employment in goods production. And a third potential weakness is an increase in relative demand for services. So maybe as people have become wealthier, as their incomes have increased, that the demand for services will actually increase more than the demand for goods. You know, we do often see that people decide to spend a greater proportion of their income on services as they get wealthier. Think about things like tourism, like other forms of recreation, but health, education, care. So these three things are not taken into account in this model, right? We just assume that the kind of desire for goods and services is always kind of half and half. We don't take any of these things into account. But that's a useful bit of this model, is just to think about how over the long run, the kind of labor required in the goods market and services market, how it's changed, because as I said, we have seen increased numbers of workers in the services market in developing countries. Okay, so that is it for Unit 16. As always, I hope that was helpful, and I will stop there.